In April's Twitter poll, superhero manga just barely beat out mecha manga. And if you're upset about the results, then you should have just gone to @TheMorlock and voted in the goddamn poll. So this month's topic is superhero manga, but we're not going to be talking about Boku My One Punch Academia. Everyone has heard about both of those. There's nothing I could say that a million other people on this platform haven't already said. So I'd much rather shed some light on some underlooked manga. To tackle this subject properly, I think I'm going to need to change into something a little bit more appropriate. Henshin! Weibo no Hero, Japan Rider! Ratman was suggested to me on Twitter, and ironically, it was also the whole reason I even put superhero manga as a topic, because I was going to review it either way. You see, way back in the dark weeb times of high school, I bought a copy of the first volume of Ratman from a Barnes & Noble, and I loved it. At the time, the concept of manga without an anime adaptation was still so new to me. Needless to say, I am now a changed man. But back then, Ratman stood out because no one else was even talking about it. It was like a nice little niche book that only I knew about. Really, at any time, at any age, you can always count on me to be a gigantic hipster. But as fate would have it, I would never read another volume of Ratman physically. When Tokyo Pop collapsed, Ratman was one of the many victims that went with it. And while Viz Media has picked up the series digitally, it doesn't look like there's any intentions to further translate the rest of it. So now it's a decade after I read Volume 1. It's 7 years after the manga has concluded, and it's 4 years since the fan translation is finished. Does Ratman hold up? Not in the slightest, but that's sort of part of its charm. Before I go any further, let's recap the premise of Ratman. Shoto, our manlit protagonist, is a kid that admires heroes. While rescuing his classmate Mizushima, he is unwittingly tricked into becoming the henchman of her older sister's evil organization, Jackal. Jackal has set itself up against the Heroes Association, which is essentially a corporation that governs superheroes. Literal corporate heroes. Ratman quickly finds himself to be a noble anti-hero in a world full of corrupt asshole superheroes. And of course, I can't leave out Ratman's own team of henchmen, the Jackies. They are the highlight of Ratman, and really could have carried it completely on their own. I never knew I wanted a manga about shocker minions miming everyday tasks, but it is funny every single time. Ratman is a comedy action series first and foremost, but that's not really getting at the big picture. In reality, Ratman is a comedy action series from the mid-2000s, a time where comedy action series grew on trees. It's completely in line with a series like Kenichi the Mightiest Disciple or Bento, and was even released around both. Ratman shares a lot in common with a lot of the popular anime and manga series around its time. It just has the superhero flavor to it. Similarly, the art is very of its time. Everyone has very big bug eyes. That being said, the hero designs are universally what I like the most. Obviously, this comes from an admiration of Tokusatsu and, Digimon? And as somebody that enjoys both, I can dig that. Ratman himself is like a Kamen Rider fan's wet dream. Please, for the love of God, make a physical Ratman suit. But most of the actual character designs outside of the superhero costumes are pretty generic, and the art looks really rushed in some places. The late 2000s, early 2010 nostalgia even extends to the circumstances that it was translated in. After Tokyo Pop dropped the series, Ratman was passed from 3 different groups, all with similar quality scans and translations. But unfortunately, that means that certain terms get renamed when the series switches groups. And more annoyingly, there's a watermark on every single goddamn page from the middle of the manga. If Ratman hit the scene a few years later, in the era of My One Punch Academia, it might have been successful enough to get its own anime. The oversaturation of the comedy action genre at the time might have contributed to Ratman being overlooked when it came out, leading to its rushed ending. The final arc is something that anyone reading Ratman in 2020 should really be prepped for. It enters into the endgame very abruptly, and because of this we get chapters that are mostly exposition, because the author is trying to tie up as many loose ends as he can. But to his credit, Ratman doesn't leave any unanswered questions. And it probably ends the best it could have under the circumstances, but you could tell that there was a lot more that he wanted to flesh out. And while it might sour the series a little bit, I still think there's a lot to like about Ratman. But either way, let's get to the rating. For our anti-heroes heroic rating, Ratman is getting a 5 out of 5. The truth is, there isn't a bad bone in Ratman's body, and that goes for the characters and the series. What sets itself up as a subversion quickly becomes exactly what it is a parody of. Relatively early on, Ratman stops doing anything that could be considered illegal activity. And by the end of the story, any character with a hint of moral grayness has some sort of redemption. But for quality, Ratman is getting a 2.5 out of 5, and that's me separating Ratman from my own nostalgia. Because once you remove that nostalgia for a simpler time in anime and manga, you get a series that is overly reliant on tropes and unfortunately makes the end result of Ratman pretty bland. The manga reeks of chunin. Chunin, or chuninbyo, for those unaware, is essentially something a 13-year-old would find cool. It's basically this.
Roxas! What'd you do with Kyrie?
She's part of the darkness now. She doesn't need the light.
You're a nobody!
And while reading it in 2020 does bring back those waves of nostalgia when this shit was cool to me, it also reminds me of why I look back at some of this and I think, man, that's pretty lame. And it probably doesn't have a whole lot to offer a new reader. But if Ratman sounds like your thing, don't let this quality rating dissuade you from reading it. However, you'll probably have a better experience reading it if you pretend that you're in a high school classroom and you're just waiting for homeroom period to end. Or maybe that's just me. Chances are you've at least heard about Guyver, or the Guyver if you're really that old school. It made a pretty big splash on the Western anime scene, for reasons I never really quite understood. I mean, Guyver definitely has its appeal, and it is good, but was it really popular enough to warrant 3 separate anime and an American movie adaptation? I'm not exactly so sure about that. This was suggested to me in a YouTube comment that also gave me a pretty good idea for another video, but maybe another time. So you've heard about Guyver, and if you haven't heard about Guyver, you're hearing about it now. But have you read the manga? Because it might be worth a look. First, let's talk about the plot a little. Sho finds himself bonded to a strange alien device, granting him the title of Bio Booster Armor Guyver. This puts him in direct opposition with the organization Kronos and their horrifying monsters, the Zoonoids. And that's it. Guyver has a really simple premise. In fact, there's really nothing more that I need to go into about the plot at this point. It starts as a humble little experiment of a manga, being the second series by author Takaya Yoshiki. His previous series, Hades Project Zeromer, also being very rough, ran in Lemon People, which wasn't an unpopular magazine, but it was a pornographic magazine. Why am I bringing this up? Well, it's because Guyver is a big step up. For the first time, Yoshiki was being published in a shonen manga, Shonen Ace to be exact. But early chapters still feel like he's just finding his footing and throwing everything that he thinks is cool and mixing it together into a story. Granted, that sort of never changes, but you know what? It works. Guyver is practically a body horror superhero. There are some pretty gruesome zoonoid transformations, and the bio-boosted armor allows Guyver to take a lot of damage. Guyver is paced like this modern-day Kamen Rider show years before the formula would be cemented by Heisei riders. Guyver's got his own finishing move, villains that lead into stronger villains, but most importantly, a secondary rider that's way cooler than the main rider. Guyver 3 kicks ass. If anything, Guyver is kind of like what a Shin Kamen Rider TV series would be like. In fact, its backstory is kind of closer to Kuga and Agito, leading me to wonder if there wasn't some inspiration going on. Of course, once you get into it, Guyver has the deepest background lore. And it's this background lore that really should be appreciated, because it never feels convoluted or out of control. In fact, the ancient alien conspiracies give Guyver a very distinct feeling from other superhero manga. And that's if the art didn't already make it stand out on its own. That's right, from the humble beginnings that Guyver's art started in, Yoshiki matures very quickly as an artist, and he starts flexing some serious skill. The art in Guyver clearly draws inspiration from Ken Ishikawa, and maybe just has a dash of the H.R. Giger thrown in for good measure. But it certainly feels unique enough in its own right. The series excels at creature design, which is half the reason why Guyver works so well for me. Because if you didn't know by now, I'm a sucker for weird Japanese monsters. In fact, the Guyver himself is such an iconic look that it is probably that alone that is responsible for the manga's popularity. But that's not to say that there aren't other standouts besides the main character. The Zoa Lord, Aptom, and my man Guyver 3 all have fantastic designs. But unfortunately, all this great art takes a great deal of time to create. And I hate to break it to you Berserk fans, but Guyver might hold the title for worst hiatuses, because they're longer than any boat ride takes. In fact, the series is still on hiatus, which makes Guyver difficult to recommend for several reasons. First off, you have every right to be worried about not getting a complete conclusion. If you want a much shorter version of Guyver, you can treat Volume 8 as your breaking point. It doesn't nearly wrap up anything, but it is enough of an arc break that you'll probably feel satisfied. That is, unless you watch the TV anime, which goes a bit further than Volume 8. It goes up to Volume 10. And if you want to see what's on that, well, strap yourself in, because Guyver enters into a much longer arc at that point. And if you're seeking resolution, you might not be entirely happy. But if you're looking for more cool fights, interesting new villains, and fantastic suit design, read on. At least until you get bored, I guess. The thing is, Guyver is all but abandoned at this point. And we're not likely to get a conclusion soon, if ever. However, in conclusion is not the only thing that makes Guyver hard to recommend, and unfortunately, this is a problem with fan translators. Guyver Advocacy is the infamous group that is responsible for holding fan translations behind a paywall. Sort of. In reality, they just want proof that you're buying the physical volumes in Japanese before they give you their scans. But even then, you're paying for scans that aren't really high quality and typesetting that is laughable. I understand their goal to want to support the creator directly, but it's going to be a much bigger hurdle if new people need to buy a manga in a language they've never read, paying much higher for it because it's imported, than if they just had the scans illegally. Because let's face it, nobody has the rights to Guyver right now. Nobody really is clamoring for the rights to Guyver right now, as far as I know at least. This is all a null point because the group at this point is so old that I can't even find anywhere to purchase their scans if I wanted to. So hell of a job supporting the creator. There are volumes of Guyver that fans will never get to see because they were released in this method. But let's get rid of the drama and get to the ratings. For heroism, Guyver is getting a 3.5 out of 5. This might either sound too low or too high depending on how much you know about Guyver, because to an outsider, Guyver might seem like the titled dark hero, but a true Guyver fan knows that show embodies all of the tropes that a young, justice-driven Japanese youth has. And I feel like what really knocks Guyver back in the heroism is the conflict itself. Yes, Guyver is out to stop an evil corporation hell-bent on world domination, but there's really not so much in the way of Guyver doing everyday hero stuff. Not that he has to. Guyver isn't a manga focused on that, and that's fine. He's not out there saving civilians' lives. Sho and his friends are really just thrown into a conflict that they have very little control over. It's much more a story about people that are heroes by circumstance rather than really any sense of moral obligation. As for the quality rating, we'll be giving Guyver a matching 3.5 out of 5, and this is pretty much a meaningless rating. Guyver is technically incomplete. You could argue that it should get no rating at all, or you could argue that I could bump it up even higher once it comes back from its hiatus, which is not going to happen. But I think that what's there, through whatever means you read it, is worth a read, especially if you're a fan of Japanese sci-fi and superheroes. If you just want to dip your feet into the Guyver pool without jumping into a 30-plus volume incomplete manga, I would recommend watching the 90s OVA series. That was my starting point for Guyver, and I still have fond memories of it today.
Hey, Japanophile. You should really read Keyman. It's really fucking cool. Hey, you like superheroes? Like, remember, it's like superheroes back when, like, Superman would fight a gorilla, but, like, you know, they were not all well cut out, just, like, super strong guys, and, like, Keyman has a superhero, but also he has a gorilla, and there's a fucking dinosaur detective. It's so fucking cool. And there's also demons. There's lots of demons. Demon shit happens, and Keyman isn't really, like, about superheroes at all. It's got this guy called Phantom. He's so fucking cool. He looks like an Ishinomori character. Then there's this other guy, he's like a fencer later on who looks really awesome and gets like a cool mask and cape. It's basically like Full Metal Alchemist, but actually not really. It's more like a dinosaur cop and a demon lady and a cool key guy, and superheroes get fucked up because fuck them, superheroes are so lame. And man, it's got like a fucking noir thing like Hellboy, which also has a story about a guy with a special hand, which is like Keyman, and Keyman has cool art as well if you think about it.
With a recommendation like that, how could I ignore it? Keyman was first published in 2011 and is Wadai Naku's debut series. Although Wadai is a newcomer, Keyman feels like a series by a veteran author and is all the better for it. His art style reminds me somewhat of an author that we covered in one of our edgy manga videos, Iwahara Yuji. But that's not to say that Wadai is an imitator. He has his own style from the get-go, and if you like what you see here, then chances are you're going to vibe with the series as a whole. Just be ready for a lot of fan service and some of the ultra-violence. In fact, there's so much of both that this could have easily made the cut for Edgy Manga Volume 4, but it's probably better off in this video anyways. Keyman centers around a simple mystery: who killed Keyman? And while this might be a starting point for several comic book series, Keyman takes it in a completely different direction. That's because Keyman, while definitely inspired by superhero comics, isn't really a superhero story. Instead, Keyman's plot takes after the pulp mystery stories. The presence of superheroes is more a symptom of the pulp fever that Keyman has. In a lot of ways, it's more of a Watchmen tribute than what later spawned off of Watchmen. It's inspired by the same sort of detective and occult stories that color Alan Moore's entire body of work. But admittedly, Keyman has more fun with the Watchmen premise than Moore ever wanted. It's a story about grizzled detectives uncovering massive conspiracies fighting against dark occult magic, except one of the detectives is a anthropomorphic T-Rex. And you know what? He's one of the best goddamn T-Rex detectives out there. Theodore Rex has nothing. Alex Rex is our main character and probably the reason why Keyman works. Despite being a dinosaur, Alex is our everyman protagonist. And when things start to get really crazy, Alex stays the same. In fact, you could say that he gets so in over his head, it mirrors the audience's confusion. And believe me, things get crazy by the end of Keyman, but it never felt like the series went off the rails. The setting and characters develop naturally. Details in the setting that you might think aren't important end up being pivotal plot points later on. Likewise, side characters that seem like they won't have much development turned out to be some of my favorites in the entire series. It feels like Wadai started with a broad idea of what he wanted to do and where he wanted the story to go, and then he filled in the gaps as he went. The Beast Man versus Human dilemma is a great example of this. It's clearly set up as an allegory for racism, but when put to the allegory test, it kind of falls apart. While discriminated against, the Beastmen have only been around for 40 years. People hate them because they're seen as genetic freaks. This allegory really doesn't hold up because it's not an allegory. This is world building, and the manga isn't trying to make a larger statement or themes, it's diving straight into the pulp. It's fleshing out the details of the world that the characters live in, and it's using that to tell the story, especially when some of these special tensions become pivotal parts of the plot. And because of that, Keyman is only getting a 2 out of 5 in heroism. The title character, spoiler alert, is a monster. In fact, anyone with superpowers is treated like an abomination. It is not a good thing to be a Keyman. But that's not to say that there isn't heroism in the story. It just comes ironically from characters that aren't superheroes, most of the time. In general, Keyman has a more cynical view of anyone with a cape and a mask than it does of your average everyday person. The only thing that's keeping the rating from being a 0 is that Alex Rex has a strong sense of morality and justice. And so does his entire team, more or less. These are the heroes of the story, even if they aren't the superheroes within the story. For quality, we are going up to a 4 out of 5. I think the enjoyment that you're gonna get out of it depends on how much you like the pieces that make up Keyman as a whole. If you dig gritty detectives, superheroes, occult magic, furry fan service, hideous monsters, or anything along those lines, you're gonna have a good time with Keyman. So it would seem that Ratman wins out in the heroism category, but Keyman steals the victory for quality. But that's just my opinion, and I'm sure some of you might disagree with me, especially with a beloved series like Guyver here. So to put me in my place, I'm going to set up another poll between all 3 series to tell which one is the best overall. And whichever series wins, gets a prize in the next video, I guess. As for next month's topic, it's still being workshopped, so if you have any suggestions you really want to get in or anything you really want to see, this weekend is the time to bug me about it. And keep an eye out on my Twitter @TheMorlock for any polls or updates on what the next monthly manga review is going to be. And as always, leave your manga suggestions in the comments below. That'll be about it for this month's manga review, so until next time, please stay Genki out there.